I wanted to like Zero Time Dilemma. My friends did not. One couldn't wait for me to play the game so he'd have someone to complain to about it. Another couldn't stand the art style and darker tone, giving up after a few hours. The vibe I got from my friends and the internet at large is that Zero Time Dilemma is a poor game and a poor send-off to the Zero Escape Trilogy. That the goodwill built up through the excellent 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, and Virtue's Last Reward was squandered. This negativity awakened a contrarianism in me. If people hated this game, I was going to do my best to love it. I was going to write about how Zero Time Dilemma is good actually. But I can't do it. There was a lot I liked about Zero Time Dilemma, but there was also a lot that I didn't, and I feel that ZTD's weaknesses both overshadow and undercut its strengths. This video will be an exploration of my experience playing Zero Time Dilemma, what I find to be its strengths and weaknesses, and my overall thoughts on it as a standalone game and as a capper to the entire Zero Escape trilogy. Enjoy! I want to start this off by discussing the first criticism folks have about the game, the art and animation style. I'm not a fan. I don't think the 3D models look good or move well. I think using models instead of portrait art makes it more difficult for the characters to be expressive. And even though the unique camera angles for every line of dialogue are engaging, I prefer the character art of the previous 2 games. I think lack polish has a lot to do with it. I noticed many scenes where a character's mouth wasn't moving while delivering a line of dialogue. After a couple of hours, I was used to the new look of the game, but I never got over the lack of polish. If I was stretching myself, I could say that this lack of polish is thematic, but I'm not doing that. The way the game is structured is thematic enough without inventing explanations for what I assume is a troubled development. In Zero Time Dilemma, we're playing the decision game instead of the notary game, and it works differently. A team will wake up in a room. Their watches will tell them what time it is, but they'll have no memories of what has happened previously. There will be a puzzle room followed by a decision, which always has the threat of death behind it. There will be a small story segment, and then Zero will activate the team's bracelets, sending them back to sleep and wiping their memories. The sequence will appear on the flowchart where it fits in the overall story, and the player will pick a new sequence for one of the 3 teams, repeating this process. Initially, I loved the concept. It made me feel like the characters. I never knew where I'd be sent, and since I wasn't being injected with memory drugs, I could start to piece together the timelines in my head over the hours. The problem is this formula is used over and over again with little variation, and by about 8 hours in, I was starting to tire of it. By hour 12 I was mad, because by this point there had been no story revelation, no narrative payoff for playing through over half the game, and looking back on the game as a whole, and how the other 2 games worked, I've pinned down why this frustrated me so much. 999 didn't have a flowchart in its initial release, but even without it, we were following a story down a path until we reached an ending. Then we got to restart and take another route. In Virtue's Last Reward, we saw the shape of the flowchart. We could follow a path to its conclusion. True, many paths were locked off until we found the keys, but it was easy to follow a story from start to finish and to uncover a revelation or 2 before the bigger narrative bombshells started to drop. Zero Time Dilemma is unmoored. We never know where in the flowchart a new gameplay chapter will take us. We're no longer following one pathway to its ending and then choosing a new one. We have to keep multiple story strains in our head as we play the game, so when a revelation does happen, we have the necessary groundwork for it to hit properly. Yes, in Virtue's Last Reward, the different paths of the flowchart symbolized different timelines, and the same is true for Zero Time Dilemma, but at least VLR's flowchart has some goddamn flow to it. That leads me to my favorite part of Zero Time Dilemma. Virtue's Last Reward was about Sigma's power to shift between universes in order to find the one in which everyone lives. That's how Akane managed to survive as a child back in 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. In ZTD, almost every character can shift, and one of the purposes of the decision game is to awaken this power within all its participants. The death games have cleverly played with this. There's a game where you have to not push a button. If the button is pressed, the whole complex explodes. Of course, I pushed the button, then reloaded the flowchart and withheld my desire to push it. There's a dice game where if a 1 is not rolled on all 3 die, Carlos, Junpei, and Akane will, die. Statistically, there's a 1 in 216 chance of rolling this. The first time, they all died. The second time, they all died. And then the game forces the right roll on the third attempt. As a final example, Phi is stuck in an incinerator. Sigma is clamped to a chair with a revolver aimed at his head. Diana has to pull the trigger. If she doesn't, Phi will be burnt to a crisp. There are 3 bullets in the gun, so Sigma has a 50% chance to survive. This decision has 3 different outcomes, one of which leads to the game's best revelation. Often, we need to see every outcome of each decision game in order to gain the right information to move forward and reach the good ending in which everyone survives, just like in 999 and VLR. But does everyone survive? There's a sequence near the end of the game where Junpei and Carlos are forced to play the AB game from Virtue's Last Reward. No matter which choice we make, one side picks Betray and the other side is outraged before they die. Then a new path opens up on the flowchart. Before the game even begins, Carlos has memories of being betrayed in the AB game. We've already learned that as a firefighter, Carlos has relied on his intuition in order to rescue people and avoid death. It's how he was able to rescue his sister in the fire that claimed their parents' lives. Carlos has always been able to shift, but not voluntarily. It is here that Akane explains their power and what it means, using the example of Back to the Future. Akane says that there are 2 types of time travel stories. The ones where any action taken resets the timeline as if it was always meant to happen, and those where every action or choice plays out in a different universe. Both are unethical because both involve murder. In the first type of story, which Back to the Future is, Marty changes the timeline and his dad becomes a successful sci-fi author. Marty's family is wealthy when he returns to the present, but he's retained the memories of his life before. So, what happened to the Marty who grew up in that wealthy household? Well, either that consciousness was erased when Marty came back to the present, or it was swapped with the original Marty's history, and since there's only one timeline in this type of story, that branch ceases to exist. But what are the other type of story? The one that uses multiple universes? Well, that's the type of story that the Zero Escape Trilogy is telling, and it's no less unethical, it's far worse actually. In the previous type of time travel, only one consciousness was being erased. With a multiverse, there are countless versions of these characters, countless histories for their consciousnesses to jump to. Each time our characters jump, they swap with the consciousness of the bodies they're jumping into. And seeing that it often takes life-threatening danger to induce a shift, those poor other versions of them are being thrust into a different body in an unfamiliar situation, likely to die shortly after arriving. To survive the events of 999, Akane would have sent many different Akanes to their death, similarly with Sigma in VLR. Zero Time Dilemma is compounded by the player controlling multiple characters with the power to shift. Heck, once Carlos realizes that shifting is possible, C-Team subjects multiple versions of themselves to horrific fates just to be able to escape. Yes, the good ending is the one in which no characters die, but reaching that ending necessitates the murder of countless versions of the core cast in a multitude of other universes. A couple years back, I made a video on a game that features the multiverse as a plot device. In the comments, a friend of mine gave his opinions on multiverse theory, but more importantly, how it impacts the storytelling of any tales that use it as a device. Basically, the multiverse removes the stakes of a story. If a character makes a decision and dies, there's another universe in which they survived. If that's the case, why should we care? Now, in my mind, the idea around this is simple. The story should make us care about this version of the characters and the fate of their particular universe. Of course, that got me thinking why that would be the case. Just because we were introduced to this version of the characters first, they're more important than all the others? Well, yes. We are more inclined to empathize with the versions of the characters we were first introduced to, especially if the story shows us stark differences between them and the versions of them from other universes. In Zero Time Dilemma, however, there's little difference between how the characters behave in the different histories, at least on a personality level, and I think that's because the decision game is a closed system. For these characters to be trapped in this death game, they had to make certain choices to get to this facility. In all the histories the player encounters in ZTD, we're getting roughly the same Carlos, the same Akane, the same Sigma. You get the picture. Yes, there are bad endings where a character loses their mind and goes on a rampage, but that's always in response to something else that happened. For example, we don't get to see a universe where Akane is evil, just one where Junpei was butchered and she thinks Carlos is responsible. And because all these characters are roughly the same from universe to universe, we don't care about all the versions that end up dying as we try and reach the universe where everyone escapes the facility. If all the characters share the same goal throughout all these universes, why does it matter which version of them gets there in the end? But that's the problem. The use of shifting into other histories as a plot device lowers the stakes because it makes death so meaningless, even though this revelation of how shifting works changes the way we perceive the use of the narrative flowchart. On a mechanical level, the narrative flowcharts in VLR and Zero Time Dilemma are an abstraction for the benefit of the player, a way for us to see which threads are left to explore and which is the best way forward. In Virtue's Last Reward, I loved that Sigma was shifting his consciousness between realities because it created a narrative explanation for the actions the player is taking when they hop to a new node on the flowchart. After the ethics in shifting revelation in Zero Time Dilemma, it makes me look at Virtue's Last Reward differently. In VLR, Sigma was swapping consciousnesses with the Sigmas in those timelines, and I feel bad about how many versions of him had to suffer to reach the ending of that game. And the reason I feel bad about all the other Sigmas in VLR when I don't feel bad about all the other dead versions of the characters in Zero Time Dilemma is due to the context in which the games are presented. In VLR, we follow Sigma from start to finish. The narrative flowchart starts at the top and then branches out as decisions are made. This is technically true in ZTD as well. Both games have an initial decision that branches off into all the other timelines of the game. The difference is, in VLR this is straightforward, and in Zero Time Dilemma it is not. The first decision game in ZTD is to choose which team of 3 characters to sacrifice. If a team is picked by both other teams, they die. Seeing the final door of the decision game only opens when 6 players are dead. Killing the other players is heavily incentivized. I made my choices and it resulted in a team dying, but then when choosing the first vignette to play through, the characters who were killed shifted into an alternate timeline in which they lived. This first decision game taught me 2 things. One, that no choice is permanent because when picking a vignette from any team, I'll be traveling to a universe where they survived the first decision, and 2, I would never have any idea where in the story I actually was. This is why, even though the revelation of killing an alternate consciousness upon shifting is impactful because it makes me think differently about the two previous games. The way those games are structured allows us to connect to the main characters, as those games have a main character. And when it comes to killing off alternate versions of these characters in ZTD, once again I ask why we should care. Zero Time Dilemma doesn't make me feel the effect of such a revelation because it doesn't matter to the characters, and it has little impact on the story. Yes, the final decision of the decision game centers around the ethics of this revelation, but it's a false decision. The complex is going to explode. All the characters have a choice. They can either shift to the start of the game, thereby saving their own lives and subjecting those versions of themselves to an unwarranted death, or they can stay in this history and be blown up. Choosing to stay leads to a game over. It's a false choice. The only way to see the ending is to shift. I thought it odd that the first choice the player makes in ZTD results in Zero freeing everyone without having played the decision game. Now so close to the end, we see this happen so our characters have unblemished bodies to shift into. In this timeline, no one has died. The decision game never happened, but we see the consciousnesses of these characters get overwritten as the new versions shift into them. Those poor souls are about to be blown up without knowing why. Again, the ethics of shifting and how these characters are murdering other versions of themselves is a great moral quandary, especially as it's the final choice of the game. But ultimately, it doesn't mean anything because only shifting leads to the good ending. That, and our characters have already murdered countless other versions of themselves before reaching this point. But before I can talk about the ending, I have to talk about the reveal of Zero. Half of my dislike of this revelation is due to my expectations based on the previous two games. The other half is what I feel is poor execution. In 999 and VLR, Zero is one of the participants of the nonary game. In both games, finding out Zero's identity is shocking and well executed. The reasons for why they put together the nonary game are compelling, and the revelation puts the entire game in a new context. I'm a firm believer in a narrative revelation or twist being successful if it makes you think about the story so far in a new context. Zero Time Dilemma does not do this. Zero is not one of the participants. Well, he is, but in a way that I find to be cheating. During the research phase of this video, I came across all the supposed hints that lead up to this reveal, but even though seeing the seeds planted is cool, it just never worked for me. Zero is Delta, the other child of Sigma and Diana in the history where they're trapped inside the game, sleep together, and use alien transporters to send their children back in time. This revelation of Phi being the other child is great. It's my favorite part of the story, and it foreshadowed the Zero reveal. Zero had to be the other child, but which member could it be, and what was their motivation? Seeing I didn't think it was one of the characters from the previous games, I thought it was either Carlos or Eric. Yeah, that wouldn't have made much sense, but it's better than what we got. Phi and Delta were sent back to the early 1900s. The scientists who extracted them from the transporter sent Phi forward in time as part of another experiment. Meanwhile, Delta spent all this time using his mind-hacking abilities, yes, you heard that right, to learn that some people had the ability to shift realities, and that a great calamity was coming. Not Radical 6, but something that would wipe humanity completely off the map. So it may be obvious, but none of the participants of the decision game are an old man, at least none that we can see. We thought the boy with the Yoko Taro head was named Q, but he was actually Sean. Q is Delta, who has been there the whole time as the head of Q Team. He was in the decom facility with them, but the player doesn't get to see him until he appears for the reveal. It's basically a "ta-da, I've been here all along" moment, and boy howdy is it some bullshit. But let's move past how infuriating the reveal is. So, what is Delta's motivation for putting together the decision game? Well, one reason was the game had to exist for him and Phi to be born. That's the same logic that Akane had to follow to survive her nonary game as a child. Delta also wanted to strengthen the ability of a team of shifters. That was one of the motivations behind the nonary game in VLR, but Delta's greatest motivation was to get everyone to a point where they were determined to make a difference. Yes, this is how the game ends. As you might imagine, the characters are incensed once they make their final shift and Delta appears. The thing is, in this reality, Delta has done nothing wrong. No one has died, and there's no longer any evidence of the decision game. Also, by thwarting the creation of Radical 6, instead of leading humanity down a path where only 2 billion survive, the history they are in now leads to the annihilation of everyone. But our characters don't buy that. Because of what they went through, they have the drive to change the future. There's a "we'll make our own future" speech before Delta hands Carlos a gun, saying that the final decision game is if they want to kill him for all he did in the other histories. And then credits. That's how the game ends. No sir, I don't like it. I don't like it because the motivation of Delta to send them through such horrors to strengthen their resolve, followed by what I felt was such a weak rallying cry of "we'll stop what's to come," didn't work at all. I found it puerile. They're okay with doing what it takes to save humanity because they were put in a situation where they chose to murder alternate versions of themselves to survive. How does that work? Not to mention that one of the characters, Mira, is an actual serial killer who undergoes no arc of growth during the game. I think that's my problem. Because the story is told out of order, even if I felt that these characters underwent a significant change in their personality and outlook, which I don't, I wasn't able to follow their journey. Then, instead of anything definitive in the game's final moments, instead of a resolution to not only this game's story, but the story of the 3 games that have been leading up to this moment, Zero Time Dilemma kicks the can down the road. The events of this game were a precursor to a future calamity that needs to be stopped, and despite the intended positivity of a rallying cry, it actually ends things on a down note. Virtue's last reward was about creating a good timeline by traveling back to the Mars testing site to save humanity, and now, when Zero Time Dilemma ends, we find out that this good timeline is even worse. All we're left with is the resolve of our characters to stop it from happening, whatever it is. No wonder I feel like my time was wasted. So despite enjoying elements of Zero Time Dilemma, such as the ethics of shifting, some of the decision games, and the revelation of who Phi is, it was overshadowed and undercut by the Zero reveal, the weak rallying cry, and the non-ending. Luckily, it doesn't lower the love I have for 999 and VLR. Heck, the revelation of what happens when a character shifts adds texture to those games, which will make me think differently about them in the future. As a game, I found Zero Time Dilemma disappointing. As a send-off to the Zero Escape Trilogy, I am ambivalent. As it's the final game, a player can just play 999 or VLR and still enjoy the highs of what Zero Escape has to offer. But even as disappointing as I found ZTD, I think it's a worthwhile inclusion to the series due to how it links to the previous games. And looking forward, it's feasible that creator Kotaro Uchikoshi could make a 4th game based around the calamity that's to come, but I don't know if I'd want to play it. After revisiting this series, I think all of these characters deserve a break and some peace. As do I. Thanks for watching. Hey folks! Well, we're at the end of another video. Now, this one did not take as long as the Persona 4 video to come out, but well, it took 2 months. Eventually, I'd love to get these videos back to where one is coming out every month. There have been periods of the channel where I've been able to do that, but I guess just with everything that's been happening this year with my health, with life, just the world in general, I can only do what I can do, right? Well, I would very much like to hear your feedback on what you thought of the video. This one was a bit strange in that it was the script that took me more time than anything. Initially, I wrote it very quickly, but I spent a lot of time in the editing stage. Ironically, you know, with the video you just watched, I was not happy with the script's ending. It just didn't kind of have that final oomph to say what I really wanted to say about the game, and it took quite a few more passes of the script, expanding on my thoughts. Just I kept adding more and more words to the script. It kept ballooning, and I'm like, geez, you know, usually when I edit, I like to cut down all the words that aren't needed. Sure, I expand some concepts, but, you know, editing is supposed to be shortening, not expanding. But I guess I needed to tease out exactly what my thoughts and feelings were on the game. I think I got there in the end, but please let me know what you think. Now, at the end of the last video, I did say I wanted to try something new in regards to what the next game I'm going to cover is. It's not exactly new. A few years ago, I'd say I tried it first in 2017, then once in 2018. And because my organization skills were not as good back then as they are now, in certain regards, it didn't work. Basically, back then, I polled you lovely viewers on what game they wanted to see me critique next, and then it would take months for me to get to that game, so eventually I just started picking them myself. But I'd like to bring that idea back. See, Zero Time Dilemma was actually the final game I wanted to cover for 2021. Yeah, that was it. At the start of 2021, I made a list of like what game I wanted to cover for every month of the year. And I slowly been working my way through that list, and finally, almost in 2023, I've completed it. Woo! But the thing is, at the end of 2021, I also made a very similar list for 2022. And seeing we're in September, I think I'm going to have to throw that list out. But there were 3 games on that list that I wanted to play in 2021 more than anything else on my critique list. So my thought is, I'm going to tell you what these 3 games are, and I'd like you to vote on which one you'd like to see me do a critique on next. Now, I'm going to cover all of them. What's going to happen is, what you pick, I'll do that video, and then at the end of that video, in this on-camera section, I'll then list the 2 remaining games. I'll have you pick which one of those you'd like to see next. And then finally after that, we'll do the last one standing. And if this works, well then at the end of that 3rd game, I'll think of 3 other games that I'd like to do in the future, and we'll do this all again. So, what are the 3 games? The 3 games are Control, Yakuza Kiwami, and Nier Automata. So, in the comments, along with your feedback for this video, what you found interesting, what are your thoughts and feelings on Zero Time Dilemma, please also tell me which of these 3 games you'd like to see me cover next. And until then, well, I hope you're enjoying your gaming, I hope you're staying safe, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day.